I was here 3 years ago, so I know how excited you must be and how tired you must be. And let's see, I was trying to pull my thoughts together, and Blair, in some ways, you took some of the words out of my mouth because you were pointing out some of the connections that were really beautiful between these 5 pieces, and I'm sure whoever grouped them together did that on purpose, which was really nice. But I'm a high school teacher in Oakland, and I was in the MEET program, and I read these in a random order that was perfect, and it wasn't the order in which they presented, and it was like one paper gave me an idea, and the next paper elaborated on the next paper, looped back to the first one, and it was really beautiful. So I kind of sort of wanted to just a little bit talk my way through that really quickly in the order that I read them. But before I do that, another big thing, and Blair, you did also sort of say this, is, and when we started with this idea of contextualization and how that might, and especially in your paper, how that might teach empathy. And one of the really beautiful things I saw in the project, empathy that the teachers were really showing for their students. And I thought that was really lovely. And then the other thing that this reminded me reading your papers, and I know it's completely unrealistic, right? But that, as 3 years out of my research project, it's a really great reminder that this research and inquiry cycle is in fact good teaching. Not to simplify your work at all, but ideally that sort of thought process is kind of what we're doing, or we're supposed to be doing all the time. And it was a really nice reminder, and Caitlin, your project in particular, just like really exemplifies how that research is just reinforcing good teaching, and you can see it just going round and round. So I guess the theme that kind of came out, I thought was, and it wasn't, I don't know if it was on purpose, but at least out of Ginny and Madeline, Caitlin and Blair's papers, is that, what do you know? Students are all different, right? And that's also a really great reminder, especially when we're sort of in these boxes, and the students really describe, some of the students describing in these boxes that still are kind of factory model of education, that taking a little bit more, taking a step back or taking a step in, as you guys were doing, to get a more holistic view of students can be really illuminating. And so I read Caitlin's paper first, and I'm an English teacher, so it's like, oh yeah, I really think about writing notes. It was really relevant to my daily life, and I thought your findings were super interesting. And one finding you kind of said this in your PowerPoint, but that I know that you didn't think that journals ended up serving a purpose that you thought they would, but at the very end of your paper, you have this beautiful paragraph where you're describing what each student needs, and you learn that from the journals. And so I kind of think that that might be an additional finding for you, that the journals could be a tool, maybe not for idea development the way that you thought, but certainly for assessment of where students are in terms of idea development. I thought that was really nice. And then I read Madeline's paper. No. Yes. And I learned so much. And, right? Yes. And that was, you were writing about self-regulation, right? And this extremely ambitious project. And I was reading and I was understanding, and I actually understood your paper better after reading Blair's paper, because I had not heard the term calibration gap before. And as soon as I heard that term, I was thinking of like 4 of my boys in particular in my class. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's exactly what's going on. But I felt like Madeline, the idea of the calibration gap actually really does sort of emerge in your paper as well, where you took some of the ideas, I mean, you did this on purpose, but the way that I was reading it, it's like your paper took some of the ideas of Caitlin's, of sort of like writing and what individual writers need, right? That there was this difference in terms of perception of what they needed they thought they needed and what you thought they needed and how to get there. And so there seemed to be a little bit of a calibration gap there, actually, in some of your focal students. And, although you didn't use the term academic self-concept, which I also hadn't heard of, but it makes so much sense. You were talking about metacognition, so there was that nice overlap there. And then I read Blair's, and that sort of, as I said, helped me make, not the statistics part, that did not help me make sense. Just so you said that was fun, but I don't know. But your terms, your concepts helped me understand the previous two papers better. And then I read Ginny's, which sort of again, further crystallized the concept. And I was thinking a lot about how to understand Blair and Ginny's papers together. So both about academic self-concept, but in some ways really different. I mean, your students, Ginny, your students were so positive about their school experiences, but there was a calibration gap there too, because they're in an intervention program, so something went wrong, right? And Blair, I remember reading your students, they seemed a little bit more negative about school in general, at least your focal students. But I was trying to think about how, reading those two studies together might help understand even some more of the complexity of those two concepts of the actual achievement, especially achievement of critical thinking, that's what we care about, right? Which kind of brings it back to them because the word contextualization is a form of empathetic critical thinking even. I did have one final idea. I think those are all my ideas. I'm sorry, I hope they made some sense. I was thinking about, Blair, you were talking about surface approaches and deep approaches, and Ginny, you looking at the K-8 experience, and I also just ran the other day at an Oakland district meeting, read a chapter from one of Delpit's books about the sort of reductionist teaching that so many of our students, especially urban students of color, experience. And of course, that sort of reductionist teaching is teaching surface level approaches. And I was wondering if perhaps, and I think you guys probably have really different teaching contexts too, but I was wondering if perhaps some of the calibration gap in high school was possibly caused by surface level approaches in K-8 experiences. So, okay, they remember these beautiful social experiences, but what are they blocking out? Are they blocking out these sort of humiliating rote memorization, really insulting experiences, and then they get to high school and we're asking them to do critical thinking, and they don't know how because they haven't been taught how, which is why starting in 6th grade is an awesome idea, or even earlier. And I think that's what I have to say. Oh, papers.
Hi, my name is Dave Donahue, and I have the pleasure of being the faculty discussant for one of the papers, the Brigham papers. It's especially rewarding for me to be the discussant for this panel because I've gotten to teach all of you, and it's really lovely to see the work continue. And all of you have been in my class, and Madeline's even had to suffer with me more because I've been her supervisor, and so I've really gotten to see you develop and grow over the last several years, and that's why reading these papers was really a thrill. So I will just admit I didn't maybe read them with the eye of a peer review critic who was looking at them for whether they'd be publishable. I had a different set of lenses. I am reading a ton of papers these days, and I decided I was going to read these papers for pure enjoyment. And the lovely news is, one could read these papers for pure enjoyment, for one's own learning, and to connect to one's own thinking and to deepen that thinking. And One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately, particularly with the help of a colleague, Anna Rickard, is the nature of dilemmas in teaching. And so I was really thinking about these papers in terms of what they could help us think about dilemmas. And that's kind of my feedback for all of you too, is how the research and the inquiry you did, I think, can help us frame with more sophistication and work through dilemmas in teaching with more nuance. Many people begin teacher research because they have a problem they want to solve. There is something about their classroom or their kids that isn't working the way they want, and they want to fix it. And instead, what people learn when they do teacher research is, oh my gosh, it was more complicated than I thought. And that's because it's really about dilemmas. And so I wanted to say a little bit about what I mean by dilemmas, and then I'll share what I saw as some of the dilemmas I think inherent in the work that our panel of teacher researchers did. In thinking about dilemmas, I bring a couple of assumptions about what teaching is and about what research is. And I think they're both very messy endeavors. And you can see all the ways in which teaching is messy. It raises all kinds of questions which have no simple answers. And similarly, research and inquiry is messy. It has no simple answers. I mean, research is all about how we frame problems and how we think about what data counts, and then what do we do with that data when we're looking at it. The good news is that all that uncertainty poses dilemmas, and I think dilemmas can be really productive sites for inquiry, and particularly inquiry about teaching and learning. So what is a dilemma? For those of us who live in the Bay Area, this is one dilemma we might be familiar with. There are dilemmas all around us. What are we going to have? And is it locally sourced? And is it we can see that Puritans had dilemmas, priests have dilemmas, or they have a dilemma. It's interesting to see. The Puritans have a dilemma, and the priests have a dilemma. I got really into Google Images lately. I'm going to share with you some of my excitement around Google Images and surfing through Amazon and finding all the books about dilemmas. Animators have a dilemma. Lexicographers have a dilemma. My favorites. Billionaire babies have dilemmas, which I'm not sure if billionaires have dilemmas about a baby or billionaire baby. Clearly, there's something troubling. Nancy Drew had to solve a dilemma or had to think about a dilemma. Now, I wanted to point out that they just had that one singular dilemma. Look at what teachers have to deal with. 55 teaching dilemmas, which I think is actually an undercount. So what do we do with dilemmas? Well, this is a shameless endorsement. Anna Rickard helps us think about what we do with dilemmas. And I'd like to share, in her new book, which I want a percentage of for all sales this weekend, this presentation, there are a number of dilemmas in teaching, and I want to say a little bit what a dilemma is. I want to say, first of all, a dilemma is not a problem. What you see in that picture is a problem. There is a horse stuck in a hole. Today is the running of the Kentucky Derby, so this would be a particularly nasty problem to have if we were. But it's a problem because we don't have to think about, what should I do? What you have to do is you have to get the horse out of that hole. I love this little image too, because I think actually the problem there is not the philosophy, but that's the English teacher in me, I guess. Problems, and this is the way I think teachers start off when they are thinking about inquiry and research. They're technical, meaning you can probably find one right answer, and it's probably going to not be value laden. In other words, once you find that one right answer, you can implement it, and poof, away will go the problem. But in fact, what teachers often face are dilemmas which are messy. They have multiple responses, meaning that's why the title of Anna's book is What Should I Do? Because there are many things you could do, all of which could be construed as right. And what is right depends on how you parse out the values involved. And because those values compete, you can often only manage those problems. You can't make them go away. So as you try to think about managing dilemmas, and this is something that I want to challenge our teacher panelists to think about, we have to think about what are the values embedded in the question or dilemma we're looking at, and I love, Caitlin, you use the word dilemma a lot about, those journals, and I'm sure you were thinking about them first as a problem, like I'm going to fix this journal problem, and then, it really becomes this dilemma, because you have to think about how do I frame a dilemma in ways that avoid blame, and this is where I want to congratulate all our panelists. Sonia mentioned that they had wonderful empathy for their students. The easiest way to frame a problem in teaching would be to blame students. What's wrong with kids today? That is not the starting point for the inquiry that these teachers have presented. Instead, they're trying to figure out what's going on in the situation. And so they're really avoiding blame, both blaming kids and just blaming themselves, because it would be easy to do that as a new teacher too. And I think new teachers often go to that place of like, oh my God, I don't know enough, I'm not qualified. And there's always more to learn, but it's not your sole fault either. So what you have to do in parsing out these dilemmas is figure out how to balance these competing values. And sometimes that's called satisficing, because you have to sacrifice something to satisfy the situation. So there's just a summary of what a dilemma in teaching would be. So our challenge as teacher researchers is to use inquiry to shed light on dilemmas and avoid coming up with these best practices that become prescriptions for other teachers. And again, I want to congratulate these teachers because they really located their inquiry very locally, thinking about what it means for them instead of coming up with, here is the new best practice that other people need to implement. On the other hand, so much of what we read out there and so much of the policy that comes down at the federal level, state level, local level, is all about, you must implement this. And in fact, really what teachers need to do is they need to use judgment and they need to make many decisions that are value-laden. So what did I see as the dilemmas of teaching highlighted in the research that I got to read as I went through the brick over the last few days? As I went through them, I guess, in a different order from the way they presented or Sonia read them, so I'll just take them in the order I looked at them. In Blair's, I was thinking, a real dilemma in thinking about academic self-concept is how do teachers focus student attention on the qualities of deep learning rather than on the surface features of school? I think this is really hard because we live in a culture that's really focused on achievement and rubrics that explicitly lay out what the features of achievement are, and often we can focus on the surface features, and that's another way that teachers might get in the way of deep thinking. And that to me is a real dilemma, because we want to be explicit with students about what we want, but sometimes as we make it really explicit, we can, in some ways, put up that explicitness can be a door that helps them go through, but it can also be a wall that blocks them from going deeper in their thinking. And then how do teachers create opportunities for critical thinking in classrooms where doing school is often rewarded more than transformative learning? And I borrowed the doing school from Ginny's paper. We want students to engage in this kind of deep thinking, but the pace of what we're doing all the time is, I hear teachers all the time say, well, I have 3 days to teach the Depression because we have to get on to World War II the next day. I only have 4 days for World War II. So there's this relentlessness to the curriculum, and I think that creates this dilemma. How do we teach students about all the things we want to teach, and yet still give them those opportunities for deep thinking? In Madeline's research, I was thinking, how do teachers develop ownership of academic work versus imposing external control? Madeline, your work is really about getting kids to self-regulate, and that's, I applaud you for that, because that's where we want to go. And at the same time, teachers are being held accountable all the time, and the more that we're held accountable, the more we want to try to control things, and the harder then it gets to let go and give students that control so that they regulate themselves. And that seems to be a dilemma that comes out of this research. And then how do teachers balance being effective with being efficient? I was just struck at how much time it took to develop that self-regulation, where there's also this countervailing pressure to have the kids write at least 10 essays in a marking period or whatever else they need to do, rather than keep revisiting what they're learning about essay writing. In Caitlin's research, I was thinking, how do teachers incorporate the research-based practices of others, which is what the journaling is all about, and where that idea comes from, and how do you do that in ways that actually meet student needs? And then how do teachers balance students' evolving thinking with the developing writing abilities? I thought it was really interesting that you want to do idea development and you want them to get better at writing. And I don't think those have to be contradictory, but often they are placed in contradiction to each other. In Lynn's research, I was thinking, as I was reading, how do teachers balance distance and immediacy to help students look at a hot topic like prejudice, and is it better to have them go back to the Han Dynasty, and what can they do, or is it more to pull them up to the present? How do you go back and forth to do that? Because ultimately, we want them to think about prejudice in the Han Dynasty so that they could live different lives in this century where we're living right now in North America. And then how do teachers balance understanding the past with understanding the present? Finally, Ginny's research makes me think about how does one teacher respond to the unique needs and history of many students. That is a true dilemma, as you pointed out in your paper. I thought it was interesting you raised explicitly this question too. How can focusing on a few students benefit all students? And I saw that as something that could come out of all of this research, and I actually have a thought about that at the end. One or two other things that just struck me as connecting all this work is so many of these teacher researchers were looking at the importance of academic self-concept. And what I learned reading their papers was about the ambiguity of that concept, how constructs are related to student learning are also very student-specific. So particularly later in your research, we can come up with a global concept like academic self-concept, but understanding what that means for those students and understanding what it means in that high school and what it means given their histories of education, as Ginny's been unpacking, that's a really much more nuanced understanding of academic self-concept than one global construct, which will help explain how well they might do in a course or on a test. I was really struck by the dearth of thinking in schools as I read these papers. Not the dearth of thinking in their classrooms. I see you as champions standing against that. I saw you doing this research because one of the things that was troubling you, or that you were finding out, is that students weren't having as many opportunities to think as you would want them to. And so their academic self-concept might be high because they're really not doing a lot of thinking. Therefore, it's easy to do well at stuff you don't have to think a lot about. Therefore, you think, I'm a great student. Students may focus on their strengths and, think about Madeline, your work, they might focus on their strengths and community. They really have a lot to say about their strengths, but much less to say about their needs. And I thought that could come from them focusing more on what they want to say rather than thinking about the other that is reading what they have to say and how they communicate. And, Caitlin, I was saying they may write a lot, and they do this throughout school. And what I like about your research is you really went back and thought, okay, they're writing a lot. And the principal might come by my room and say, kids are busy, it looks great, and you get a great evaluation. But you're really wondering, what does that mean for their idea development? And I think, returning to that journal writing could be a place where they could begin to do some of that idea development. The last thing I want to point out is that research into student learning is research and teaching. Every single one of you, I felt, by virtue of doing the research, was in some way further teaching your students. It might be very directly as you're working with them one-on-one, or it might be that you are also just improving your own teaching practice by taking a much closer look at what you're doing. So I want to applaud all of you. I want you to continue doing this kind of inquiry, although I guess I want to modify it a little bit. You don't necessarily have to produce bricks anymore. But I hope that this kind of inquiry is a habit of mind that's just embedded now. So that even if you're not writing a paper, not worrying about a literature review, you're always thinking about that cycle that Madeline was pointing out, where you're questioning all the time your forethought as you go into practice and then reflect and then create this new cycle of forethought. So congratulations to you all.